Hello, and welcome to All Things Considered, a podcast where we discuss important issues with fascinating guests through the lens of critical thinking. I'm your host, Dr. Christopher DiCarlo. Today's guest is Dr. Lenore Newman. She's the Director of Food and Agriculture Institute at the University of the Fraser Valley, and she holds a Canada Research Chair in Food Security and the Environment. Dr. Newman is also an Associate Professor in the Department of Geography and the Environment at UFV, and she's a member of the Royal Society of Canada's New College. Lenore researches agricultural land use policy, agricultural technologies, and bioengineering. There are two extremely important topics that we talk about today, which are as world-changing as they are mind-blowing. And they both involve drastic changes to the future of agriculture. The first is precision fermentation, and the second is cellular agriculture. What are these things? Well, precision fermentation involves the changing of products of food into other types of food. So imagine drinking a glass of milk, which never came from a cow. Cellular agriculture, imagine eating a pork chop, which doesn't require the killing of a single pig. It's a brave new world out there, folks, and we're going to take a look at just how brave it is. So without further ado, let's consider the ideas, values, and thinks of Dr. Lenore Newman.
The power of our democracy.
All right, Dr. Lenore Newman, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing today?
Oh, not too bad. It's great to be here.
Good. Good to see you. Weather's good out in BC where you're at now?
Yeah, we're getting a little extended summer into September, which is always nice.
It is. It is. It's pretty nice here in Guelph, Ontario. Now, as you know, I'm from Guelph. I'm currently in Guelph. We have the University of Guelph. It's a pretty big agricultural school. I'm sure you've got a few colleagues here that we could probably touch base on at my old alma mater, the U of Goo. But there's really two things I want to talk to you about today. And these involve drastic changes to the future of agriculture. And that's precision fermentation and cellular agriculture. Let's start with precision fermentation. For those entirely unfamiliar with what that is, what is it and why is it important?
Those are two of my favorite emerging agricultural technologies. So very happy to dive in to the wondrous world of the future of protein. Starting with precision fermentation, which is basically we take old school fermentation, the oldest food technology, food preservation technology. And the old school method, of course, we take sugars, we feed them to yeast, and the yeast produce alcohol, which is a really good partnership for us because we end up with alcohol or bread or other fermented foods. And basically, precision fermentation involves taking yeast, bacteria, or fungus, and you alter it to produce other products. And this is actually fairly old technology now that really underpins the heart of genetic engineering. And so the first use of this technology was the production of insulin. And insulin is an interesting product because sourced out of nature, and it usually came from pig pancreases in the old days, it had a lot of problems. So if you developed a pork allergy, which a lot of people did after a while, you had a big problem. It wasn't acceptable for Muslims if it was sourced from pig pancreases. And also quality varied radically. And so what they realized was they could take the genes that make insulin, splice them into bacteria, and make it that way. And all insulin on Earth now is made in that way.
Mm-hmm.
And so that technology, that actually was the first real application of genetic engineering. And that then spread rapidly. And the first food application, which is a really interesting one, is the creation of chymosin, or vegetable rennet, using the same technology stream. So if you go out and buy cheese, odds are 9 out of 10 times the coagulant in that cheese was produced by a bacteria or a yeast that was engineered to do so. And so what we've realized is you can make almost anything this way, and it is a truly disruptive technology. You can produce dairy proteins, for example, which I do a lot of work on, and you can produce fats. And so what you can do is brew, I mean, sort of the punchline to this story, you can brew milk like you would brew beer. And that's probably a good place to turn it back to you in this wild world where suddenly we don't need a cow.
Yeah, like this is kind of blowing my mind in terms of how I'm trying to imagine what the future is going to be like. It makes me think of the movie The Graduate. There's a classic scene in it where he's at a party, right? A guy pulls him aside and he says, "I'm going to give you one word about the future: plastics." Right? It was a big
Yes.
moment in cinematic history. Today in agriculture, would that word be something like yeast? Like, is it that big?
It definitely would. I mean, I think the word these days is protein diversity. And there's a number of reasons for this, but yes, it's of the kind of future forward technologies that are coming along the pipe. Precision fermentation is one that I will actually give 100% bet on that it is how we are going to produce a large part of our protein portfolio in the next 20 years or so. And it's quite far along, which is really interesting. And it's kind of the sleeper, as it were, because most people have heard about growing, say, a burger on a lab bench. So it gets a lot of press. But the truth is, if I get in my car and I drive across the border into the US and walk into an average grocery store, and there's a couple of them I could pick, I could buy ice cream that is made in this way. And because the product's already at market. Company named Perfect Day out of San Francisco produces proteins that are then incorporated by other companies that make ice cream. So in Washington State, which is the nearest America to me, I would go in and pick up a pint of Brave Robot ice cream, and it would say something really interesting on it. It would say non-animal dairy.
Wow. So that exists now.
Yes, I can buy that product about the same cost as I'd pay for high-end ice cream, like a Haagen-Dazs kind of thing.
Right.
I've toured their facilities in San Francisco Bay Area and tried their product, and I can't tell the difference. So, these technologies are now is the thing. And yeah, for Canada, it's a massive opportunity because we produce the precursors to these technologies, and really sky's the limit on precision fermentation.
Now, people watching and listening, I'm sure, are thinking the same thing I am. I want you to take us, just assume I'm in grade 5. What is yeast? And how does this whole thing happen? I know what yeast is in beer or bread, I have a vague concept, but I'm hearing there's lots of different types of yeasts out there. People are going out and finding new yeasts and whatnot. What are they and how do they work?
Yeah, and I think probably the easiest way is if you really think about dairy. It's a weird product because cows don't make dairy because they're cows. They make dairy because they're moms. And so basically we sneak in and steal their milk. And they're an animal that produces this byproduct. And you just have to sort of think of yeast as small organisms that produce things, much as the cow is a large organism that produces things. And the same goes for fungus and bacteria. But let's just focus on yeast because it's easier. So
Sure.
yeast is a little tiny organism that multiplies by eating sugars, and as it does so, it produces byproducts, which can, in traditional, when you make bread, it's, it produces carbon dioxide, which makes your bread puff up, and it makes alcohol. But what you can do, especially now using CRISPR technology, which is, of course, vastly better than we had 20 or 30 years ago when we started this, you can splice in genes that make it produce other things. Much as our cells produce all sorts of things, depending on how they're coded, we can basically rewrite the coding of these little yeast animals to produce other byproducts. And that's where we get these proteins.
Right. By produce, again, simplify it. Are they eating something and crapping something out? Is that
Yes,
essentially
exactly.
it? So that's it.
Yeah, just much as our cow eats cellulose and starches, our yeast does the same thing. So yeast traditionally eats sugar, and what that translates into in the real world is it can be straight up sugar. Like if I'm making rum, I use sugar cane. But if I'm making beer, for example, I use grain. And what I do is I take that grain, I cook it to release the sugars, I feed it to the yeast, I get beer, and then I'm happy. And same thing here. And so what we can do is we can take grains that are, or sugars that are produced here in Canada, which we are a world superpower in. We feed them to our yeast, and then our yeast gives us a bunch of things, including complex proteins and fats, because we've rewritten the coding of our yeast to do that. And yeah, this is done in a vat, much as we do with beer. And then every now and then we can bleed off all those byproducts, and it's just like milking a cow, except, a little different. I would say more complex, but it really isn't. In a way, we've simplified the process. And the key to what is happening there is we've taken the cow out of the equation. And that's really a big breakthrough.
You've taken out the middle animal. Well, that's amazing to me that this exists right now. What kind of momentum is it gaining? Like, I've got way bigger philosophical questions for you later, but how are we seeing this developing steam at the current time?
It's definitely the technology in agriculture I'm watching most closely in terms of immediate breakthrough, because it is at industrial scale already, rapidly scaling up, and the technologies are very amenable to other products as well. So basically, most things you can produce in an animal can be produced this way. And so, yeah, a lot of venture capital going into the space, a lot of new companies starting up to do the same as some of the real big founding companies. And if we look at Perfect Day, which is the largest of these companies, it's already a unicorn, as we like to say. It's worth probably about probably $2 billion now. And so those products are just going to continue to grow. It's the one that people are going to see first in the market. And all of a sudden, yeah, you'll be like, oh, animal-free dairy, that's pretty cool. And I think we're very close to that spreading rapidly. But because it works so much better than the cow way of doing it, it's likely to be quite disruptive and largely take over the production of dairy proteins.
I bet. Now, I live in Guelph. There's a lot of dairy farms in this part of the country. What's been the reaction of dairy farmers? They can't be super thrilled about this new form of technology coming along and maybe putting them out of business, or they're going to have to transfer.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And one of the things my group studies is the effect of disruptive technologies. And we've seen that a lot of times. I mean, the sort of absolute perfect example is the recent is looking at how Uber disrupted taxi drivers. But we've seen this numerous times in our lifetime. Probably a great example is digital photography, basically obliterated an entire industry that had a big Canadian presence. I mean, Eastman Kodak used to be a thing that we had. And so technology is always really disruptive. This one is going to be quite disruptive. And so you see two responses. Well, three, because most dairy farmers at the bottom end of the industry, that sort of ground floor, they're not too aware of this technology yet, much as most taxi drivers didn't really know about Uber until it was there. If you go up a little bit, there are some people who are very worried about this because they do see it as a potential disruption, but there are also definitely dairy protein companies that are very interested in the technology. Because if you think about it, the larger companies in these fields, say Tyson is a great example. Tyson Foods, they kind of control chicken in North America. They see themselves as a protein company, not a chicken company, because they don't sell you the chicken. They sell you pieces of the chicken. And so they've been large investors in a number of these technologies.
Oh, is that right?
Yes, and same with, there's some fairly large dairy companies that have invested in cellular, and we'll probably see more of that, because at the end of the day, we might buy milk, but for the most part, the milk is a small part of the market for the average person. We buy liquid milk, but that's been going down for years. Mostly we buy byproducts like butter or cheese or sour
Right.
cream. And it's also interesting because this sector is already disrupted. Because, number one, a large majority of humanity can't use dairy products because of lactose intolerance. And so there are a number of plant-based substitutes as well. So one of the reasons I find this area so fascinating is we will have a point at which we have three competing technologies: animal agriculture, plant-based products such as oat milk, and fermentation-derived dairy products, as I usually call them when I'm writing about them. And those three things will be kind of fighting it out for market share, and that's going to be quite fascinating to watch.
It is. Now, you deal in policy as well, and so I'm just wondering, whenever there's a radical shift in infrastructure and society, there's always a kind of an almost revolutionary backlash. So I'm just wondering, in terms of policy change, how are we going to then transition from the traditional way we've been producing these types of foods? And then how will we assist in policy development to help the dairy farmers either make that transition or phase them out? Or will there always be dairy farmers and this type of technology kind of running side by side?
It is a really interesting question to think about what the policy implications are, especially for precision fermentation, because the products of it tend to be recognized as what we call generally recognized as safe.
Right.
And so they do enter. That's why we can buy these products in the US already, because they received regulatory approval very quickly because they're identical to the product they're displacing, and the technology chain is known. The fermentation chain is very well understood. And so, yeah, it does leave us in this interesting point where in some jurisdictions it will be a pure market competition, like in the US. And down there we'll have plant-based and animal-based and fermentation-based all fighting it out. And, I doubt the US will do much to assist their farmers, because traditionally they don't assist people who are being disrupted. Sometimes there's pockets of it because, it's a very disruptive landscape. And here in Canada, it's an interesting one, though, because of our very unusual level of government interference in the dairy industry. And so I'm a fisherman's daughter, and my family owned a fishing company, and we were heavily disrupted by declining fish stocks. And the government did a little bit to assist with transition out of that industry. I think we'll see a little more for the dairy industry, because the dairy industry is going to shrink because of this technology. Guaranteed 100%. It's like I say, don't shoot the messenger. It's just going to happen. So we need to get ready for it. But every Canadian who pays taxes heavily subsidizes the dairy industry. As we know, hundreds of millions of dollars go to keep our dairy expensive and to provide a steady income through supply management. And supply management's a very unusual tool. It does lead to a very stable farm environment, but in a way, it almost makes the dairy industry more vulnerable to disruption because it keeps prices so high. So if fermentation products come in at like a third the cost of Canadian dairy, we'll get the equivalent of everyone driving south to buy cheese, which is a thing that happens here in British Columbia. In that cheese is so much cheaper just across the border. People drive south, buy cheese, drive back.
Right.
And I think we'll see an equivalent there. So yeah, I think there will be government assistance to the same degree there always is, but maybe a little more, because this is an industry the government likes a lot.
Have you received contact from anybody at, say, PETA or other groups that are interested in the ethics of animal activity within agriculture?
Oh, yes. I work closely with that side as well. And a lot of these companies are being run by vegans and plant-based folk who believe very strongly. The ethics behind it really drives it, and it is true. I mean, it's one of the reasons I study it as well. I myself eat a plant-based diet. My partner's been vegan a very long time, and the ethics definitely come into it. And for myself, as someone raised in the slaughter industry, I
Right.
think we tell ourselves a lot of uncomfortable truths, we keep ourselves protected from the reality of animal agriculture, and the truth is, we don't need, maybe in the future, to kill or treat poorly all of these animals. And the uncomfortable reality of dairy, the way it's traditionally done, is that to have dairy, you produce these small cows that are a byproduct. In any industry where baby cows are a byproduct, they're going to constantly have to be trying to get past that in the public eye. And once you have a perfect substitute, I think it just happens. And to look back historically, anytime a technology displaces an animal piece, the animal piece tends to go away. And so the examples I like using, whale oil is a very good one.
Yeah.
The development of kerosene basically ended an industry that was causing the extinction of animals that were probably just as smart as we are. And it was a horrible industry and a violent industry for both the workers and the animals. But it was needed because people liked the lights to stay on and liked having the products. But petroleum completely replaced that, to the point where I don't get up, saddle up my horse, and ride down to the neighborhood whale oil emporium. Even if I do all sorts of retro things, whale oil is just not a technology anymore. The same with equestrian use, of course, and it was the example, and my colleague Evan Fraser from Guelph loves using this one, so I'll give him credit for it, that at the dawn of the 20th century, horses were seen as one of the biggest environmental problems for urban areas, because if you went to New York or Chicago, there were mountains and mountains of horse droppings everywhere and dead horses all over the street, because the average street horse in New York or Chicago had a lifespan of about 3 or 5 years, because it's so hard on them. And people were worried then. They're like, look, in the future, if we run this forward by like 1940, we're just going to be besieged with horse droppings. Of course, that didn't happen, because we developed the ultimate disruptive technology that completely remade the world. And so anytime animals are displaced, they tend to be almost fully displaced. And I think eventually, in 40 or 50 years, that's what we'll see for dairy for sure, is near complete replacement. I mean, there probably will still be pockets of dairying for specialty high value products. So, Parmigiano Reggiano probably isn't going anywhere. It's been there for hundreds of years.
Right.
But people need to realize before they get all, I always find people get in a fuss and they pick the highest value thing they can think of and get really worried it's about to disappear. No. We need to realize 80 to 90% of dairy in North America is an ingredient. And it's like milk solids. It's an ingredient that if it was substituted, you wouldn't even notice, because it's not something average. People don't have a bag of milk powder in their pantry. It's an industrial ingredient, and most animal products in North America go into the industrial food system.
Is that right?
Yeah. So people don't see that, because, to be honest, we've done a really good job in the food industry of making sure people don't look too closely at it, because it can be a little intimidating sometimes. But yeah, that's what we'll see replaced first, and it's massive. The environmental and ethical benefit of replacing that industrial dairy chain, it's massive. There's probably nothing else on earth we could do with a bigger, bite in terms of climate. It's one of the biggest.
Oh, good. Now, I remember reading somewhere that you had mentioned about 70% of all milk just becomes powdered and is used as kind of an ingredient in other food products.
It runs 70 to 80% in North America. And I mean, if you've ever dealt with being lactose intolerant, this becomes really visible really quickly, because it's just everywhere. You pick up like a bag of potato chips and you're like, how is there milk in this? And there is, snuck in there. And that can be so easily replaced. And it's a real nice quick win. So I think that's what we'll see first.
Not exactly like high fructose corn syrup, but it is put in a lot of stuff.
Actually, it is a bit similar. And, to people who have traveled in the US, and if you're trying to avoid high fructose corn syrup, it's just everywhere. And you're like, why? Why is this stuff everywhere? And yeah, it kind of gets slid into everything. So definitely, I think, we're going to see massive levels of replacement at that industrial level.
Okay. Now, let's talk a bit about cellular agriculture, about meat, protein production, pork, chicken, beef, fish, what has been referred to as lab-grown meat or meat in a vat. Right now, there are about 70 companies currently working on ways to develop the production of meat and fish without actually growing, harvesting, or killing them. Before we get into the big philosophical whys of this new form of tech, can you tell us a bit about exactly how and where this is being done? Where are these 70 companies? Are they worldwide? Are they mostly in Canada and the US?
Well, actually, more like a couple hundred.
Oh,
now.
Wow, it's grown.
The industry is changing really quickly. It tends to be rising in places with high technology indexes and places where food security is something they think about. So hotbeds are Singapore, China, the Netherlands, because they are early leaders in this field. Israel has put a lot of money into this, and our old friend Silicon Valley. In Canada, Toronto is a bit of a hotbed. There's at least a half dozen fairly active companies, if not more, and a lot of interest in growing that space. So it's emerging anywhere there's high tech. This is emerging. Anywhere there is concern over food security, this is emerging very strongly. So it's a very, very exciting time to be in this field. And the way I like to look at it is 10,000 years ago or so, we domesticated animals for food production. And that must have been a very exciting time. This is as fundamental a shift as that.
Interesting. So the advent of agrarian societies 10,000 years ago pretty much changed the world as we know it. We wouldn't we having this conversation if people hadn't done that. We'd still be nomadic and moving around. As Shirley Valentine said, digging in the ground with the ass bone of a giraffe. But now we have developed forms of technology that seem almost like if the development of agriculture was the Gutenberg printing press, this technology is the internet. Is that what you're saying?
It is. And, as someone who, was in Silicon Valley when the internet technologies were rolling out, there was definitely a stage where no one really thought, there was a lot of skepticism and a lot of articles in Time Magazine and New York Times saying, oh, the internet's over. It was a fad. AOL subscriptions are falling this month. It must be over. And yeah, now we all carry it around with us at all time. I really do think we are watching the end of animal agriculture, and which makes it the most exciting time to be in agriculture for millennia, which is kind of nice.
Yes.
I think it follows the general law of technology. People expect things to happen really quickly and they don't. And that's one thing that happens. But the other thing is people tend to underestimate the long-term implications of disruptive technology shift. So I think we are seeing one of those, and it could be quite profound to how we interact with animals and how we interact with food and how we use our land base.
Absolutely. Now, in 2010, my son was in high school, and he got invited to Queen's University in the summer for a week-long business camp or whatever. And at the very end, his group had to do a presentation on new inventions, new developments, whatnot. And he called me and he said, "Dad, what do you think? What should I propose and whatnot?" And I had read an article, and he and I had discussed in vitro meat at that time. And this was in 2010. And he comes back to his group and he pitches the idea, and they had never heard of it before, but they decided to go with it. And when they presented it, it just kind of blew everybody away in 2010 that this technology could be real. Where are we now in terms of the development of this technology?
Yes, and the beauty of this technology is, of course, it scales in a way animals don't. So yeah, we go from, say, the Mark Post burger, which is kind of a milestone. That public burger, cooked and eaten in London, probably cost about $250,000 to make one burger. Now we're really down. It's hard to say exactly where we are, but we're talking about $50, say, to make a burger. And so we've had this rapid scaling. And what we're going to see is it gets exciting. And my colleague Sylvain Charlebois out at Dalhousie often says the exciting part happens when these foods get radically cheaper than the animal products, and they should, because the animal products, even with all the subsidies we dump on that industry, are getting more and more expensive, as people have noticed. But these products get cheaper and cheaper and better and better. And one of the things I love watching is, so the first Impossible Burger 1.0, was not great. I did try one of the prototypes, not great. Then we get the first one to market. It's pretty good. You're like, oh, this is pretty good. It's too salty, but it's pretty good. Next version, you're like, oh, good. They addressed that salt problem a bit. And they've just released the sort of next version of Impossible, which is a precision fermentation product, in that it's a plant product with precision fermentation additives.
And the yeast produces heme, is that correct? So fake blood.
Yeah, and there's a Canadian company actually that produces some of the heme that goes into those burgers. And, the version now, it's pretty good. And they're making it, healthier. They're getting rid of some of the fats. And you look at it and you realize, boy, in 5 years, this thing's going to be amazing. And it's probably going to cost like $1 a patty. And you realize, wow, scaling is neat. And, we have to realize too that the animal system, leaving aside the ethics, which I don't feel we can do, but let's leave that aside for a minute. If we look at animal agriculture over the last 50 years or 70 years, this amount of scaling they've achieved is impressive. In that the average broiler chicken, for example, is about 300% or 400% bigger. And to the point that they have trouble standing up on their own. They only live for about 6 weeks, 12 weeks through breeding. And so if we look at animals, especially in the chicken, like the smaller animals like chickens and pigs, they look nothing like the counterparts of the 1920s and 1930s farm. They're vastly different. They taste vastly different. They, the average consumer would probably not like a 1920s chicken because he'd taste like bird, not like nothing, which is what we want these things to taste like. So people need to realize it's not like, and the thing that drives me nuts is when people talk about natural. Well, there's nothing natural about a cow. The cow isn't even a natural animal. It's bred out of the wild auroch, which is extinct. And so it's a total human creation that produces way more milk than any natural cow, natural auroch would. And it's been bred to do so. And as a result, it doesn't live very long. And people have this vision like there's a cow and the cow's around for ages. No, the cow's around for like 5 to 10 years. And yeah, so talking about natural is a bit of a false flag operation that we see a lot.
Yeah. In philosophy, we call that the naturalistic fallacy, right? If it's natural, it's good. It's not natural now. So then what about the people listening now who are saying, I don't like it. It's made in a lab. You're messing with nature. You're screwing around with my food chain. If it doesn't live on the land and if it doesn't bleed, I'm not eating it. And how do you respond to people who might be a little hesitant about this new form of technology?
Well, in a long-term sense, they don't matter. Sorry, guys, but people adapt, and that adaptation, it's a bit like my parents' generation. They don't use iPhones, most of them. My niece and nephew always have their iPhone. I usually have my iPhone. There's discontinuity that occurs over time. I think though part of it is how well we've managed to hide the ugly side of animal agriculture. Because if we get right down to it, and one of the things I often am thrown at me is, well, in nature humans are omnivores. Well, no, they're not. This is actually untrue. We're carrion eaters, which is very different, in that we are totally unequipped to kill anything without tools. And so in the wild, whatever that means, we would have come along and maybe a lion left some scraps. We could eat that if we're desperate because we're carrion eaters. And the average North American is a carrion eater. And it's just a little cleaner. It's like, and I find it amazing that if they are driving along the highway and they see a deer that's been hit by a car, they're not going to stop and throw it in the back and eat it. Even though there's probably some decent meat there. They will go to the supermarket and do the exact same thing because it has been coded. And this is where we get into your field, and I think it's fascinating. It's been codified, it's been cleansed. And the term I like to use is sin eater, in that we have appointed a subset of society that suffers greatly from this to do our killing for us. And what we know is the people who do our killing suffer from a lot of injuries. And I saw this firsthand growing up. I mean, I myself have injuries from working in the meat industry, in fishing. And, hard on the body, hard on the mind. We know that slaughterhouse workers in particular end up with really bad PTSD because you're killing large animals all day. Of course you do. And we don't care. So we offset all of that. And so I just think it's really quite amazing how our society did that. And I think the emergence of a new alternative that does not involve that sin, as it were, is a game changer. Because suddenly, instead of doing something you kind of need to do because you want to have some hamburger, I mean, the killing has even less reason than it does now. Now, of course, on the veg side, everyone's going to, and I totally agree. I mean, I don't need animal products, but we know that culturally they're deeply embedded. We know that people really like some of the associations with them. They're deeply embedded in our cooking methods. So yeah, most people are not willing to make that shift to say, okay, I'm just going to eat plants, even though it would probably be better for them. So we give them a substitute that's good enough. They're probably going to look at it and say, oh, well, we don't really need to kill the cow because there's a big pile of cow right here that was grown in a lab that's healthier, that doesn't have cholesterol, that, can be tailored for whatever I want, and that doesn't involve putting a steel bolt in the head of a 2,000-pound animal.
That's right. This is fascinating, and it's happening in real time right now. We're actually living through this period. It ties in with a philosophical, ethical theory called utilitarianism, or the greatest good for the greatest number. And it looks like that's where this is headed, this form of technology. It's good. It'll be good for us. It can be good for the environment. It'll be good for the animals. What about with utilitarianism? We don't have a crystal ball. So we once thought thalidomide was good for controlling morning sickness in women. And then we realized not a great idea. It causes deformations in offspring and whatnot. So we can't look far enough into the future. But what about the idea of longitudinal studies in terms of health benefits and whatnot? Is somebody going to be working in those areas to assure the scared public of, I don't know if I want to put this into my body. What am I going to turn into in 5 years after eating all this in vitro food and, the cellular, agricultural byproducts and stuff? How is it going to affect me? So is somebody doing work in that area now?
Well, I think what I'll do is flip it on you.
All right.
Because I think we'll look back at industrial animal agriculture as the thing that nearly killed us. Because 40% of the Earth's land surface is now used to feed us. The bulk of that 40% is creating industrial scale animal agriculture that causes huge environmental impact, to the point I think in 100 years we'll look back and think, what were they thinking? Like, they cleared the Amazon for cows.
Yeah, for Burger King.
We will also look back at the diseases that go with excessive meat eating and probably think, what were they thinking? Much as we do with smoking. And, I'm old enough to remember when, everyone smoked. My mother was told to smoke when she was pregnant because it was good for her. and we look back at that, and now we're like, what were they thinking? I mean, it's so dumb. And to the point, in North America, at least, smokers are shunned. We'll probably look back and think, what were they thinking? There were all these clear links in the literature between, dementia and heart disease and strokes. And they kept eating all this animal protein day in, day in, day. And we'll probably look back at that as well. And so the short answer to your question is yes. But the nice thing is, because a lot of these products are just simply less damaging for people than the animal equivalent, we're pretty, there's a whole system to make sure that that the food system is safe. And so it's why, I can eat that dairy product without even worrying, because it's generally recognized it's safe, it's been tested, and the truth is it's genetically identical. Anything it's going to do to me is the same as dairy would do to me.
Right. So there's no change in cellular structure, there's no change in byproduct development, it's still DNA. It's still
exactly. And it's the same with, and I have eaten cell meat as someone who is, in the industry, as it were, and I have tried some of these products that are not on the market. But I mean, I feel happy to do that, because if I eat, say, a piece of cellular salmon, which I've done, it's just cells. It's exactly the same as if I'd taken a salmon and eaten a chunk out of it. It just grew in a slightly different environment. And, I'm simplifying a little bit. But here's the thing. What we see with these technologies is a generational turnover. Also, we do have a bit of a North American bias, and the rest of the world does think differently than we do. And there is a great demand for more animal product in a lot of the world, and no way to produce it.
Mm-hmm.
So these technologies are very popular elsewhere, partly because of that, because there's no way to scale meat production to serve a growing demand in China, for example. In large parts of the world, in Africa, we cannot meet that demand with conventional methods. We can't. It's a physical impossibility. So there, it's about producing protein at all.
Okay. Now, in terms of occupying space, will cellular agriculture take up less space compared to current methods?
Oh, that is so neat. And yeah, and as someone who does a lot of land-based work, the weird problem with animal agriculture is how much space it takes. And it's it's why in the last couple of years I've been working with Evan Fraser at Guelph, writing a book called Dinner on Mars, where we design a food system for the Martian environment. And one of the problems we run into is you can't put animals in there because they just take up too much space, because they're so inefficient.
Right.
And my team's estimated we could get about an 80% land saving, which means for every 5 acres being used to grow mostly, corn and grass to feed to animals, we'd take 4 of those acres and put it back into forest. It's a game changer. I mean, it doesn't fix climate change, because you actually have to stop putting CO2 in the atmosphere, but you get rid of all the methane, which gives you this little bump right away, buys you some time. And you also, the reforesting that land gives you a one-time sequestering of carbon that's actually really significant. Now, you do need to have policies to make sure we don't build mega malls on all of it or something. You actually have to direct it back into forest, but we can do that. I think it's actually the biggest non-ethical reason to do this. Is the biggest environmental reason is the land saving by far.
Interesting. So if I'm a farmer down in Brazil and I've got my cattle and I've clear cut my land and I'm producing all this beef for McDonald's and Burger King, because you did say somewhere most of beef goes into freaking hamburger. Is that true?
It does indeed.
Most beef goes to making hamburgers.
About 60%.
Wow.
60% in general goes to hamburger, which is great if you're a cell ag company, because it's way easier to do that than produce anything else.
Yeah, of course. Wow. Is it because it's the biggest bang for the buck? You can make the most?
It's cheap.
Yes.
Beef's expensive. So, yeah, and to be honest, it's easy to cook. It's easy to handle. It's easy to eat. And that's been a sort of sneaky little thing in the background. One of my students summed it up well in that I mentioned that a product like a steak is really hard to do. It's hard to make. And one of my students is like, come on, Lenore, steak is the new golf. Who eats a steak? And I'm like, what happened to golf? Is golf bad now? And they're like, no one plays golf anymore. And I was like, oh my God, I feel so old. But, and I think that'll be interesting, and it tracks. And my student stumbled on something that historically tracks, is when industrial chicken entered the food system in the 1910s, 1920s, basically consumption of game birds fell to 0. And that's because it's really hard. If you're eating a game bird, it's all bones and it's really gamey, and suddenly you had this product way easier to deal with. I have a feeling that if this follows down this path, in 40 or 50 years, young people might be like, oh my God, there's a piece of skeleton. Why did they eat that? Like, how did they eat a steak with a bone in it? That's just like twisted. They might look at it that way. The same as someone today sitting in a square doesn't look at a pigeon and say, lunch.
No, that's right. That's right. Yeah, of course. Now, so what will the transformation look like in your estimation over the next 50 years? How do you envision the farms of the future? What will they look like, and how will they operate, and how will current farmers then handle that transition?
Yeah, I think if we look down the road, if we assume that we don't all die, which we're going to for this little exercise, I think we would have a much greener world that is a lot more primary forest. I think the idea of killing might be a lot more unusual, because I think once we stop having to indoctrinate children, which we do, into the idea that we kill things for food, which we even now we solely do for pleasure and cultural reasons. We don't actually need the protein anymore. We've got lots of other ways to do it. But as that becomes easier and easier, that indoctrination will stop. I think we might actually have nicer people.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in 50 years, the transition will be done. But the next 10 are going to be really interesting as these technologies kind of play around. I think we'll see some of the largest animal agricultural producers. We're talking about a $2 trillion a year industry. So it's not going to roll over and die that easily. But some of the biggest players are going to flip. And they're going to move heavily into the cell space and really push it to scale. And to be honest, the worst position to be in is probably a small to mid-scale farmer in these areas, because you're just going to get crushed. And so, my message to them is get out now while your quota is worth a lot. And, I think that's actually probably pretty good advice. I think for a very long time, there will be like high-end products will have a niche for at least 20 or 30 years, at least. So high-end dairy, high-end animal products. I think we might see some, like in my own industry that I was born into, in fishing, we might actually see closures because we do have endangerment of fish stocks. We might say, well, okay, let's just stop so that these stocks can recover, and we'll just pivot fully onto substitutions. It'll be different in the land animals. I think that will continue to some degree. And yeah, I think one of the most fascinating ones for me will be the battle between cellular agricultural products and plant-based. And we'll see hybrid products as well that are half and half, much like an Impossible Burger is basically a hybrid.
Sure. And then how cost effective will this new technology be for, say, developing nations? Is it only going to be a tech for G20 countries? Or...
In the long run, food will be nearly free. That is my bold prediction.
Okay.
These technologies have the potential to be so good that we'll be able to produce food for almost no cost, much the way that for all intents and purposes, carbohydrates are nearly free. I mean, I know when we go out and buy a loaf of bread, we're still paying money, but boy, we're not paying very much. Same with breads, pastas, anything that's a carb is really cheap. And I think we'll see now, we've already seen proteins and vegetables tend to be really expensive, which is a problem because then we eat too many carbs because they're cheap. We'll see a similar thing. It could be the dawn of the age of nearly free protein, and everyone on Earth could finally have enough protein.
Interesting. And then why do you think younger generations are more concerned about animal ethics? Is it social media, education, parental influence, or as Peter Singer might suggest, are we simply learning to expand our moral circles to include more species for ethical consideration?
I think at the root of it, you have to be taught to kill. I believe there's a bit of an intrinsic hesitation to take a life of any sort. And we see that. And, I see that in my own family, where the generation after me hasn't been taught to kill things, and it's not a natural act to them. And I will admit I feel a certain level of remorse myself in that, I know when I walk into a room of urban people, I've probably killed more things than most people because I grew up the industry I grew up in, unless there's like a chicken farmer there.
Right.
And most people, when exposed to this, they find it a bit repulsive. And I think once that isn't needed to maintain this industry, this production of protein, I think that's where we'll get to. But yes, children have to be indoctrinated into meat eating because they intrinsically are repelled by it. Most children, when they find out that fluffy things are being turned into dinner, they are upset. They have to be taught. And if you look at children's books and media, and one of my colleagues studies this indoctrination process.
Oh, yeah?
It is a very interesting thing. And I mean, it's a bit similar with getting people to kill other people, which we don't want them to do almost all the time until we do. And to get the stats, and we don't talk about this very much, but the stats are, when people are sent to war, say you conscript an army and you send them to war, a very high number of people will not actually kill people, even in a war, even to preserve their own life. There is a hesitation. And it takes a lot of indoctrination to get people over that hump. And it causes a lot of psychological damage. And I think what we'll see in a world where you do not need to do this, we simply won't. And I think the response to, it's so interesting to me how animals go from product into not product. And so, as an example, whales are the ultimate one. Most people are repulsed by the whaling industry. Yet, there's a tiny bit of it on Earth still, and we're repulsed by it. It makes the news. And when we see acts of profound animal cruelty to animals that we feel are inside the wire, as it were, we're repulsed. Most North Americans won't eat horse meat. And if they do, they feel a revulsion, even though it's eaten elsewhere. And so that line of who's in and who's out, it moves over time. And I think there is only one way it's going to move.
Interesting. Do you think, very few people will talk about the elephant in the room, but the last major spreading of respiratory pathogens around the world largely came from China and came from wet markets. And we now know that things like bats are very good at, zoonotic transmission to other species onto humans and whatnot. Do you see ways in which we can then address that issue by providing new technologies where people don't have to go into caves to get these creatures that we shouldn't really be intermingling with?
Well, and that is another interesting one in that the rise of industrial agriculture has so pushed into wild areas that a lot of these zootropic diseases have emerged in a time where we're doing intense animal agriculture. And if we look at zootropics, especially some of the really terrible ones, obvious one that we've all lived with, COVID, that sucked. and we could say, and of course we can never say exactly, but we could say, if we weren't doing intensive animal agriculture on this planet, maybe we'd have dodged that. And if we look at others, though, there's a much more direct link, like SARS, for example, or HIV, to use a really, damaging example where disease jumped the barrier from animal to human. And we even the flu of the early 20th century, the flu associated with World War I, there is some evidence it jumped from pigs to soldiers. And basically this is something we could largely eliminate by radically shrinking that animal hoof print, as it were. Wouldn't eliminate it entirely, but if we look at the last set of really bad diseases, we're not on a good trend line. And lowering the chance of the next bubonic plague is probably a good thing, because what we learned with COVID is we can't really stop the spread of these things. They go everywhere. We've done a really good job of, trying to get ahead of this, disease. But if you look at COVID, which is kind of a medium level disease, the level of disruption it caused is incredible. And it wasn't a disease like smallpox, where 30% of the people who catch it die. It was, moderate. So, yeah, it does seem that is another side bonus of this shift.
Right. Now, you mentioned your colleague, Evan Fraser at U of Guelph. He stated around a quarter to a third of the world's greenhouse gases come from food and farming, and that this is responsible for depleting much of the world's biodiversity. He also said it's the largest source of water pollution and the biggest use of fresh water in the world, and that this is completely unsustainable. Yet, he remains optimistic. Are you as optimistic as your colleague?
I actually am optimistic. I'm a firm believer in the ability of technology to overcome problems. I mean, I will admit the last, watching, say, the war in Ukraine unfold makes me wonder what's wrong with us. But when I look at this, we are developing these technologies. They are moving ahead. There is the potential for some very significant environmental savings and improved health situations using these technologies. I mean, I just have to have hope that we're not going to burn the planet down literally so that we can enjoy the rush of eating, a burger. I really hope that we're better than that. And I think we have seen improvement, and I see these technologies and the funding going into them and the excitement around them. And to be honest, the number of people willing to expand their plant-based eating, even if they're not going fully plant-based, is very heartening, because this is, as Evan points out, this is an area where there's, massive potential for easy gains compared to a lot of other categories.
Well, listen, I want to thank you for taking the time to be a guest on our show today. I very much appreciate that. And listen, good luck with your research and your teaching.
Oh, well, thank you for having me. And, I just think it's such an exciting time to be in this field that, I always tell my students, they picked a great time to be in agriculture. Super exciting. And, we're doing amazing things with plants and with cells. And the future is going to look different than the present. And that's always an exciting time.
It sure is. Well, thank you very much for joining us today.
No problem at all.